Hello and welcome to the fifth talk in our series. Yet again, due to government restrictions, it's not possible to live stream from the museum, so tonight's talk is pre-recorded. By way of compensation, I thought I'd bring you up here to the clock tower. It was erected in the early 19th century by the second Marquess of Hertford, and very few people managed to climb these stairs and enjoy this view of Lisburn. If you had a look down from here 100 years ago, the main thoroughfares would have been in the process of being rebuilt following the Swansea riots of August 1920. Tonight's speaker, author and historian Dr Alan Parkinson, will examine the troubles in Ulster in the early 1920s, including the Lisburn riots and the violent context that surrounded the birth of Northern Ireland. Alan is the author of a number of acclaimed publications, including 2004's Belfast Unholy War and his new book, A Difficult Birth, Northern Ireland's Early Years, 1920 to 25.
My talk is entitled The Northern Troubles, 1920 to 22. I've always been interested in this pivotal period of Irish history, and I researched and wrote Belfast's Unholy War about violence in the city between 1920 and 22, some 20 years ago. I have returned to this subject, but extended its geographical and chronological parameters for my new book, A Difficult Birth, the early years of Northern Ireland, 1920 to 25, which was published by Eastwood Books, Dublin. To look at events elsewhere in the province of Ulster, and also at the early record of Northern Ireland's first unionist government. In this talk, I shall look at the patterns and incidents of violence both in Belfast and across Ulster, as well as encouraging listeners to empathise with the predicament of Northerners who lived through these frenetic times. The nature of the conflict, first of all, the 1920s conflict in Belfast has been described as the forgotten conflict. On the surface, this seems surprising, given that the disturbances which plagued the city, in particular, for over 2 years, occurred alongside major constitutional change in the form of the establishment of Northern Ireland. This was actually opened by King George V at Belfast City Hall in June 1921. Yet historians have avoided this conflict, partly on account of the futile and nihilistic nature of events between 1920 and 1922. They've also been deterred by the often ambiguous nature of the available records, and additionally by the complex interrelationship between political developments and communal conflict. An outcome of this ambiguity is the uncertainty over whether the violence in 1920 to 1922 actually warrants the description of a pogrom. This is a definition I have problems with and actually discounted in my 2004 book, Belfast's Unholy War. In this, and indeed in A Difficult Birth, I recognise the disproportionate suffering of Belfast's Catholic population. Roughly twice as many Catholics lost their lives in the city's violence, but pointed out that there were also hundreds of Protestants who either died or were seriously injured in the violence, and the city's majority community also bore the economic brunt, some £3 million at the time, of the IRA's arson campaign. The term pogrom, especially when applied to the sufferings of Jews in 19th century Europe or in interwar continental Europe, is based on the premise of one particular religious or ethnic group being victimized in a one-sided campaign of violence orchestrated by a partisan government led by representatives of the predominant section of the community. Lethargic in initially tackling loyalist assassins in Belfast, James Craig's administration was culpable of missing early opportunities of appealing to the wider community in the new Northern Ireland, rather than restricting its appeal to his core supporters. But there's little evidence to suggest that the region's first prime minister, or indeed his officials, actually masterminded a program of assassination against the Catholic community. Yet this conflict was, without question, a sectarian bloodbath, which I called in my previous book, Belfast on Unholy War. The city was certainly no stranger to communal strife, and there had been at least 6 major riots in the city during the 19th century. These were initially caused by changing demographic patterns, including the migration of many Catholics to the city, bans or restrictions to Orange Order processions, and tension provoked by imminent political change. Particularly vicious disturbances include the Battle of the Brickfields in 1872, when British soldiers were needed to keep rival crowds apart, and also in 1886. The latter case was at the height of agitation over Home Rule legislation, when sectarian clashes in West Belfast, York Street, and central areas of the city endured for some 3 months and resulted in over 50 fatalities and 400 serious injuries. The Home Rule question again dominated political discourse in Ireland and indeed Britain just before the Great War. And when this global conflict ended over 4 years later, Ireland's political landscape had altered dramatically. Following events in Dublin in 1916, Sinn Féin's political supremacy in the rest of Ireland was increasingly evident. In the north, political tension escalated after David Lloyd George's introduction of the Better Government of Ireland Act, legislation, should I say, early in 1920. And on the security front, Unionist opinion was enraged by the killings of Gerald Smith in Cork and by disturbances in Derry during the spring of that year, when over 20 people lost their lives. I'll come back to that. This political uncertainty on the part of Ulster's Protestants, stoked by a virulent 12th of July speech by Unionist leader Sir Edward Carson, and by the continuing violence across Ireland, would soon ignite sectarian flames in Belfast shipyards. I'd like to look now at the start of the violence in Belfast. The attacks in the shipyards on the 21st of July 1920, which started this 2 year conflict, were not merely spontaneous outbursts of anger at IRA violence elsewhere. The timing of this violence at the start of the first working week after the 12th holiday suggests a measure of preparation, as were Sir Wilfrid Spender's calls for the UVF's reorganisation, as well as rumours of loyalist stockpiling of weapons from the gun running incident of back in 1914 within Protestant areas. The spark which lit the sectarian conflagration occurred in the city shipyards. Young apprentices were to the fore in the intimidation of Catholic and socialist workers, described by their assailants as non-loyal. The British Protestant Association, the BPA, had called a meeting at the smaller shipyard, the Workman Clark Yard, from where an angry crowd of some 5,000 workers marched on Harland and Wolff's extensive yards in the east of the city. Here, many Catholic workers were caught up in physical attacks, and many were injured by the hurling of shipyard confetti, as it was called, iron nuts, bolts, rivets, and pieces of sharp steel. Several workers jumped into the river to escape, and over 20 of them needed hospital treatment. The violence quickly spread beyond the shipyards, with workers being attacked by nationalists as they passed the short Strand district in their workmen's trams. Gunfire was reported, first of all, that evening, and the first victim of Belfast conflict, Margaret Node, who had been visiting her sick mother, died from a stray police bullet in Cromick Street. I'd like to look at the patterns of the violence in Belfast. The disturbances spread the day after the Harland and Wolff expulsions, when thousands more Catholics were intimidated from their workplace and also their homes. Sectarian interfaces and trouble flashpoints in the west, east, and north of the city in particular were prone to outbursts of gunfire from the IRA, the BPA, and the British Army. High velocity rifles, which could target victims from distances of several hundred yards, and even machine guns, would be intermittently used in fierce gun battles over the next 2.5 years. Hand grenade explosives were thrown at tram cars and used to start fires at commercial premises, schools, and cinemas. Catholics were in general the victims, not only of industrial eviction, but also had to endure the trauma of being expelled from their own homes. Many would actually return after a relatively short period when things had calmed down. But for others, this intimidation led to a lifetime of exile. An estimated 10,000 Catholics were forced out of their homes, with many seeking refuge in places like Glasgow and Dublin and parts of England also. State compensation for evicted workers and their families was slow to happen, and Catholics were initially reliant on the generosity of other, better financially placed co-religionists elsewhere in Ireland, England, and America. The patterns of the violence which would plague the city for over 2 years emerged within the first few days of these disturbances and bore striking similarities with riots which took place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Sectarian name calling, as well as stone and bottle throwing, often conducted at flashpoints like Millfield, the Short Strand, and York Street, were usually followed by the intervention of the security forces, and later, during the hours of darkness, the crack of gunfire from both nationalist and unionist quarters. Many of the more serious incidents had, like those in the modern conflict, a tit for tat nature, including the shooting of ordinary Catholics or suspected Republicans, either by loyalist gunmen or men in uniform. I return to this feature of the violence shortly. Soldiers and police officers traveling on trains and outspoken unionist politicians were also, like they would prove in the later conflict, would be subject to IRA attacks. Several soldiers and around 80 horses were killed in a bomb attack near Bessbrook a day or two after the opening of the Parliament by the King. Also, unionist representatives like General Sir Henry Wilson and William Twaddell were assassinated by IRA personnel in London and Belfast's Royal Avenue, respectively. Special powers such as curfew and much later internment were adopted, as they would be half a century later. The degree of involvement of the various strands of the state security forces bore some similarity with those in more recent conflicts, although there were also some significant differences. Back in the early 1920s, the army was heavily engaged in quelling the disturbances in Derry and then the summer riots in Belfast, where scores of people lost their lives, many of them the victims of military gunfire. However, on account of the sheer expense of British Army engagement elsewhere in Ireland, it was politically and financially expedient for the authorities to authorize the creation of a local constabulary, which would, from early 1921, increasingly bear the brunt of containing the violence, as well, of course, as suffering the bulk of security force casualties. Suffice to say that the RIC, and by the end of the Troubles, the new RUC, were primarily responsible for tackling acts, threats of violence, unlike in the modern Troubles, when the role of the army was more pronounced. In addition to over 50 Ulster Special Constabulary USC fatalities across the province of Ulster in an 18-month period, there were several other police casualties, predominantly from amongst the ranks of the RIC. Several of these, incidentally, were Catholics, mostly originating from the south and west of Ireland. Paramilitary casualties in these 20s Troubles were, however, relatively light, probably no more than 20, 25 Republican volunteers in the north, and about half that number of Belfast Protestant Association activists. Many attacks on individuals and groups were especially savage, and I'd like to look at a few of these in this next part of the talk. Apart from members of security forces, a host of other people were prone to sudden targeting. They included carters, who were the 1920s version of taxi drivers, publicans or barmen, and people out and about on work business. People were also targeted in tram cars, including 2 Catholics shot dead after passing a church in North Belfast. They had been seen by their assassin to be crossing themselves. And a co-religionist was also thrown off a bridge into the Lagan after getting off a tram close to the Short Strand. As Jack O'Hare, a non-swimmer, went under the water, his loyalist assailants cheered. Protestant workers' trams, which also passed through or near nationalist districts on the periphery of the city centre, were inevitably targets for attack. There were 2 fatal bombings within a 48-hour period in late November 1921. A bomb was lobbed into an Old Park-bound tram near Little Patrick Street, and the loud explosion was followed by an outburst of gunfire. The floor of the tram collapsed and its glass sides smashed to pieces. Several were hurt in this blast, including 3 men who died. 2 days later, another IRA bomb, identical attack really, destroyed a tram in Royal Avenue, injuring more than 30, including 4 who were fatally wounded. Several Catholic carters, driving their horses and carts through isolated areas in the city, were singled out by assassins, including 3 separate attacks on a single day, the 20th of June, 1922. However, Protestants were also liable to being attacked whilst executing their professional duties, with 3 workers being shot dead after being asked to declare their religion by a 9-strong IRA squad at a cooperage in Little Patrick Street. Many victims of violence were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and in some cases, one's natural curiosity turned out to have tragic consequences. Over the course of just 2 years, there were around 500 fatalities in Belfast disturbances, as well as over 10,000 serious injuries. In addition, the economic damage caused by the IRA's arson attacks and commercial properties, as I mentioned earlier, exceeded £3 million, probably in excess of 100 million today. There were around 100, 120 fatalities in violence elsewhere in the north. So the 20s troubles were, unlike the modern conflict, largely concentrated in the capital city. There were numerous other major security incidents, but time restricts me to looking at just 2 of these. On the evening of 13th of February 1922, a large group of children were playing traditional street games in the Catholic Marylebone district enclave in North Belfast, when 2 loyalists lobbed a grenade into the midst of the happy group of playing children. Apart from the 2 women who also lost their lives in the blast, several children were seriously injured, including 4 who died. Nearly 80 years later, I interviewed Sarah O'Hare, who had frequently visited her cousin, Katie Kennedy, in Weaver Street. She told me, "My cousin Katie had just started working in a mill. One night she was skipping outside her home in Weaver Street when a bomb was thrown from North Derby Street. She and several other children I had met were killed or seriously injured. Her father, John, was a fine, big religious man, but despite his faith, he never got over the wastes of such a young life." The security incident, which undoubtedly warranted the loudest denunciation, nationally and internationally, involved an apparent attempt to systematically eliminate the men and boys of a prominent North Belfast Catholic family. Owen Mcmahon was a prosperous city centre publican who lived with his wife Eliza, 6 sons, daughter, niece, and his bar manager in a sprawling Victorian mansion, a 10-hour terrace off the Antrim Road in the north of the city. Late in the evening of the 23rd of March 1922, after a day of violence, including the shooting of 2 policemen by the IRA, several men attired in police uniform broke their way into the family's home and forced the male members of the household at gunpoint to gather in the downstairs living room. After being warned by the leader of the group of assailants, "You boys say your prayers," firing commenced. Only the youngest son, Michael, 12 at the time, was not hit. Within minutes, Police and an ambulance had arrived to discover the extent of the carnage at Kinnaird Terrace. Owen Mcmahon, 4 of his sons, and Mr. McKinney, his bar manager, all died in the attack. The press universally denounced the attack, although some unionist journals refrained from speculating on likely culpability for the outrage. The Belfast Telegraph's description of the murder scene is as raw to read today as it must have been nearly a century ago. Part of it went, "The house smelt of fresh blood. On either side of the fireplace lay large pools of blood, thick, heavy, coagulated stuff that turned one sick with horror. In places, it was rubbed and disturbed, as if someone had rolled in it. It was clotted in lumps, as if someone had macerated fresh bullock's liver and strewn it all about." A few days later, the funerals of the McMahons took place in North Belfast, and the ceremony interment was at Milltown Cemetery. Apart from the sense of outrage generated on both sides of the Irish Sea and indeed beyond, there was a renewed sense of political urgency. The West Belfast MP, Joe Devlin, condemned the atrocity in Parliament. And the shootings also prompted a hastily convened meeting in London involving David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, James Craig, and Michael Collins. This led to the signing of the ultimately doomed Second Craig-Collins Pact. Although Craig was unambiguous in his condemnation of the attack, a hefty reward of £1,000 was offered for information leading to prosecution. His administration was criticised for its handling of this investigation, and indeed those involving the shootings of many other Catholics. As his subsequent hardline approach towards loyalist gunmen showed, James Craig was not averse to using the special powers available to his administration for punishing anyone suspected of such crimes. But his response to the McMahon murders was at the very least lethargic in its nature. The response was compounded by the likely involvement of a group of rogue police officers, including some senior ones like DI John Nixon and County Inspector Richard Harrison, who were, despite their denials, probably implicated in this and other attacks on Catholics. Although the bulk of the violence in the province of Ulster during the early 1920s was conducted in the region's leading city, there were several other major security incidents and tragic loss of life in other parts of Ulster. Indeed, the first major outburst of trouble had actually occurred in Derry, where a nationalist council was returned for the first time in the local elections at the beginning of that year. Regrouping also took place amongst the ranks of the city's UVF, and this an increase in local tension led to an outburst of violence in April of 1920. This was particularly heavy in May and June. At least 20 people, both Catholic and Protestant, lost their lives in these disturbances. But although further security incidents would occur in the Maiden City and its rural hinterlands, the Northwest would not prove to be the fulcrum of a sustained or long war against the British presence in the North, as would be, of course, the case during the modern conflict. This was largely due to a loss of Republican morale in the city, where IRA volunteers had to counter the threat posed by not only a strong police and military presence, but also the menace posed by the better armed battalions of the UVF. Just after Belfast disturbances in the summer of 1920, there were 3 days of sustained sectarian assaults on the homes and commercial properties owned by the tiny Catholic community in the County Antrim town of Lisburn. And I know this has been talked about in a previous talk in this series. These broke out after the murder of leading police officer Oswald Swansea at the town's Christchurch Anglican Cathedral on the 22nd of August. Over the course of the following 72 hours, the homes of Catholics, their religious buildings, and public houses were damaged and, in some cases, destroyed by marauding loyalist crowds, many of them heavily intoxicated. This trouble in the town's Catholic quarter highlighted the vulnerability of small Catholic communities living in predominantly loyalist areas. And this vulnerability was reflected by the experiences of co-religionists in other towns like Banbridge and Dromore, as well as, of course, in Catholic districts within Belfast itself. There were several major terrorist incidents along the newly created border area, which brought grief and anxiety, not just to those who lived in counties like Tyrone and Fermanagh, but also resulted in increased tension in Belfast's back streets. One during Derry and carefully planned IRA operation along the Tyrone and Fermanagh sides of the border on the 8th of February 1922 precipitated a serious conflict in Belfast, resulting in close to 50 deaths in that month alone. In the hours of darkness, a large group of armed IRA personnel crossed the border and took more than 40 Protestants as hostages. They included several USC and RIC officers, the son of a leading Unionist MP, and an elderly Tyrone landlord who bemused his Republican captors with his non-stop rendition of biblical hymns, as well as his recitation of several verses of the national anthem. A few days later, another border incident further heightened sectarian tension. A large group of specials were ambushed by an even bigger group of the IRA's 5th Northern Division in the County Monaghan town of Clones. The police officers had been travelling through Irish Free State territory in order to pick up a train which was heading for Enniskillen when they were ambushed at the town's railway station. In a fierce exchange of gunfire in Clones, at least 5 men lost their lives, including the IRA's leader in the area, Matt Fitzpatrick, and 4 police officers. And another 9 people were injured, mostly police. The IRA detained 5 more officers, only releasing them about 2 months later. Many occupants of the train carriages, as well as passengers waiting along the busy platform, described how shooting had broken out and how they had to dive for cover. One eyewitness talked about how shooting had broken out in his carriage and reported that a bullet had grazed his hat. He also recalled hearing shots being discharged all over the train, and also heard one man appeal for mercy and another man call out for his mother. Many of the fatal shootings in the Ulster countryside involved members of the police forces, particularly its new special constabulary. In fact, well over 40 of its members were shot by the IRA in attacks outside Belfast. These often resulted in reprisal shootings. Individual members of the police were involved here, including the shooting of 4 Catholics after IRA assaults in Desert Martin in County Derry on the 3rd of May 1922. 2 of the most controversial incidents to occur outside Northern Ireland's capital took place in the small County Antrim town of Cushendall and close to the County Down border at Altnavay. The first of these involved the British Army and Special Constabulary in a series of shootings which prompted critics to accuse the security forces of collusion, a frequent allegation, of course, during the more recent conflict. Although most of County Antrim was loyalist in its political persuasion, Republican training exercises had been frequently reported in the glens of Antrim. On the evening of the 23rd of June, a military detachment was ordered to investigate a suspected IRA training exercise in the hills and fields above Cushendall. Tension was already high across the north following the recent assassination of Unionist MP and military leader General Sir Henry Wilson in London. The military detachment had met up with a group of officers from the USC, and the latter apprehended a young off-duty IRA volunteer who had been cycling outside the village. When the convoy entered the predominantly nationalist village minutes later, this detainee, Seamus McAllister, along with two other local men arrested in the village, John Gore and John Hill, were shot dead in an alleyway in the centre of Cushendall. An arms search in neighbouring houses shortly afterwards proved to be fruitless. These shootings prompted a furious response at Westminster, where Joe Devlin called them willful murder, and a judicial inquiry set up by David Lloyd George concluded that no one except the police and military even fired at all. James Craig's response to this Barrington Ward inquiry was to set up his own Belfast-led investigation, whose eventual verdict contrasted sharply with the findings of the London one. The Westminster authorities reluctantly accepted Craig's request to shelve the publication of Barrington Ward's critical report, and also agreed to drop prosecutions against the police personnel who had been involved in the shootings. The Catholic minority in County Antrim clearly felt aggrieved over this attack by the specials, and this feeling of resentment was matched by the emotions of the tiny Protestant population in the farmlands surrounding Altnavay, close to Newry and the Irish border, after an invasion from the Irish Free State by members of Frank Aitken's 4th IRA Division. This was during the early hours of the 17th of June, 1922, which was the week preceding the attack in Cushendall. Some 30 volunteers moved from their base in Dundalk and attacked Protestant-owned properties for nearly an hour. In this time, a dozen farmsteads and buildings were torched as residents attempted to find refuge from the onslaught in barns or in open fields. 6 people, including the wife of one of the farmers, it was believed that she had recognized one of her assailants. They were shot dead, and several others were wounded. Reactions to these attacks were furious, with the Belfast Telegraph declaring that neither sex nor age was spared in a fury of bloodlust against this little colony of Protestants, who were isolated, defenseless, and easily murdered. In this next section, I'd like to look at what it must have been like to have lived through the conflict. And I was fortunate enough about 20 years ago to interview several of the, at that time, dwindling number of conflict veterans. That was during my research for Belfast Unholy War. I also read then and since for A Difficult Birth some of the fascinating recollections of police officers who were engaged in countering the IRA threat, and also simple, just ordinary workers like Robert McElborough, who was a gas fitter in Belfast at the time. However, most of the people I interviewed had been youngsters during the Troubles, and they, whilst heeding the advice of their parents to be careful, still endeavoured to carry on with their everyday lives. I only have time to share the memories of 4 of them now. Travelling by tram was, as I have already suggested, a dangerous activity in the early 1920s. The legendary journalist Jimmy Kelly, who worked for so many years for the Irish News, recalled one such journey from his Falls Road home into the city centre. The old red and yellow coloured tram car swayed, whined, and groaned over the rails down the Falls Road. There were certain danger points when it passed several long streets, like Dover Street, leading from the Falls to the Shankill. Across these streets at moments of tension, the report of rifle fire rang out as snipers on both sides opened up. The tram speeded and clanked past the streets as the driver crouched down on the deck behind the controls. The passengers took their cue and huddled down on the floor, which the tramways department had thoughtfully provided with a carpet of straw. There were always audible sighs of relief when the neutral Castle Junction hove into sight. Having a father who was involved in police or fire service duties mixed the heady emotions of excitement and fear for oneself and family. Sam Jemison's father was a senior officer at the Central Whitla Street fire station in the 1920s. He was obliged to live at the brigade's premises, which was a very exciting environment for a young lad. Sam told me, "My father and his colleagues were very busy during these troubles and were called out to many fires caused by incendiary devices. They were even shot at on occasions. It wasn't easy for us either, as we lived in the station and had to play in the backyard. The station also housed ambulances, and it was an exciting place to grow up in. What with the fire engines rushing out to put fires out, and the ambulances bringing in the bodies of those shot or blown up in the disturbances. They used the station as a temporary morgue, and our mothers often had to chase us away when they were laying out the bodies. Inevitably, perhaps, cross-community relationships were difficult for youngsters to maintain, given the levels of violence and the dangers associated with playing with children from the other side. Yet Catholics and Protestants did still play together in West Belfast parks and on the bog meadows nearby, where they played football and cricket and caught stickleback in jam jars. Christy Robinson's best friend at the time was a Catholic, Jackie Kelly, and sometimes they left West Belfast to find fun. Christy remembered many years later. "I remember waiting anxiously, I must admit, one Sunday lunchtime outside the Clonard Monastery off the Falls Road, where Jackie had been attending Mass. We eventually got together and set off cycling on two speed gear bikes to Kilroot. Mind you, some of those hills were steep, and on a hot summer's day, the sweat would fairly lash off us. The effects of the troubles meant that my father, John, had to leave school a few weeks early in 1922, when his model school was the target of an IRA bomb. A friend of his in Distillery Street in West Belfast's Grosvenor Road raised the alarm over a blaze close to the spires of St. Peter's Church. He realized it was probably his school in Divis Street, but his parents refused to let him investigate. However, he approached the school the next morning. I saw its charred remains. Police were guarding the building, but there was some jeering when the Divis Street boys spotted us. I wasn't that surprised, because there had been two previous fires at the school, and we had been stoned a few times as we left the premises. As this happened shortly before the end of my final school year, and the model was set to reopen on the Clippenville Road in the north of the city, quite a bit away from where we lived, my father agreed to me starting work. I'd like just in my postscript to look at a couple of things and perhaps the legacy of this conflict. The 1920s troubles, which had peaked in their intensity during the first half of 1922, fizzled out that autumn, largely on account of the effects of the special powers legislation, internment in particular, and the start of the Civil War in the rest of Ireland that summer. Yet the legacy of this conflict would not simply disappear as well. For the North's Catholic minority, the unsympathetic approach of the Craig administration to their plight and the apparent desertion of their Southern co-religionists hurt deeply. And this constituted a huge barrier during the new state's early years. The Protestant majority in Northern Ireland, although relieved that peace had been restored, would never forget what they perceived as a destructive role played by both the South in attacking their frontiers, directly in the form of physical incursions by the IRA, and economic damage caused by Dublin's boycott of Northern goods, and also the military activities within Northern Ireland of the IRA's Northern divisions. This resulted in the strengthening of an even more pronounced siege mentality. Today, as the centenary of many of these events is nearly upon us, we thankfully do not experience political violence on a daily basis in Belfast or indeed Northern Ireland. arguably the community divisions remain deep, albeit at the moment largely under the surface. And we would be ill-advised to ignore the modern history of our city and our country if we desire a better future for our children and grandchildren.
Thanks very much, Alan. That was very interesting. Sweeping, wide-ranging. I particularly enjoyed those local stories, the individual stories towards the end of your talk there. I suppose that's not something you usually come across when reading narratives of this period. So yeah, it's very interesting. We have a wee bit of time now to do a quick Q&A. Some of our visitors have sent some questions in ahead of time. Although you've sort of answered some of them in your talk already, perhaps it might bring them up again might bring us down other avenues for discussion. So this is my own question now, because I remember going to Queen's Special Collections and lifting out your book Belfast Unholy War, and it's a big volume, and sort of getting stuck into it for a couple of hours, and it was fascinating, because although I'm from Belfast, I wasn't necessarily aware of the how deep things got in the 1920 to 22 period in Belfast, how terrible the events were. I'm sort of interested in motivations of historians. Like, what was your particular interest in delving into this period?
Well, I suppose, Kieran, it was largely when I first did the Unholy War book. It was largely I had written a couple of other things, but it was largely because nobody else had really covered this. As I said briefly in the introduction, the nature of the conflict is very off-putting. It's not a nihilistic. It was a nihilistic war. It was depressing in many ways, but I thought the story had to be told, and I've revisited it again, as I said in the introduction, and extended its kind of geographical and chronological kind of parameters to look at the rest of the province of Ulster conflict there. And also, of course, at the center of both books is the interrelationship between communal violence and major constitutional and political change. And that really was motivated me to do both books. It was because it was so important, and that relationship between conflict and major political developments was crucial, and I think it's at the heart of the new book as well as the old book.
That's quite interesting, because I was reading Christopher McGill's book.
Yes, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah,
it's very good, and he draws on work by this other historian called Tim Wilson, and that's his argument about the mapping of political uncertainty onto communal violence, and certainly that seems to ring true in Lisburn. We have a precipitated act, a lot of uncertainty, and then you have violence that flows from it. And I sometimes wonder, and you mentioned this really helpfully at the start of your talk, like throughout the latter part of the 19th century, there's continual episodes of communal violence in Belfast. So almost in a way, could the authorities have foreseen what was going to come? They have a thermometer. They can see that the temperature is rising. Should they have been more aware and better prepared to deal?
Yeah, I mean, whether they obviously sometimes it's easier to say that in hindsight, but on the other hand, their responses were slow, and if they had have taken action quicker and be more sympathetic in the response, for example, of those who had lost their homes and jobs, it might have nipped support for the Republican paramilitaries a bit in the bud, but that wasn't taken. Although, as I said, they considered the IRA threat the ultimate threat, and once that had been contained, then they did show some signs of being even-handed in the sense that they interned lots of the leaders of BPA, for example, but all that could have happened sooner. And their response to the murder of the McMahon family, for instance, was extremely slow, and that was largely the fault of the Minister of Home Affairs, R.D. Bates, and basically that led to a lot of bad feeling across the whole community, in fact, but particularly the nationalist community.
Just on that point, like, so I'll talk mostly about Lisburn because that's the only thing I know about at the moment. So when the army came in to Lisburn to guard the convent and
yes,
they were kind of successful. That was a good use of resources because it managed to block the riders from getting directly to the convent and to a lesser extent parts of the church. So it actually showed that the deployment of the army in strategically important places was actually quite useful.
Yeah, they were. I think that part of the problems in Lisburn, particularly with the convent, I think the army were withdrawn probably too quickly, and because after that the violence spread across the various nationalist districts in the town. But yeah, they were used. You're right. They were used in the early stages of the conflict. But remember, of course, the war against the British was going on in the rest of Ireland, and British military resources, particularly after the Great War, were being stretched in other parts of Ireland. So they had to take a pragmatic decision, and a lot of the kind of security or the policing was actually had to be done by the police. And of course, the RUC, although legislation was in place, they didn't really come on. They weren't really formed in proper terms until the summer of 22, when the troubles were fizzling out. But yes, the army were heavily involved, and they, of course, were involved in shooting loyalists in Derry, and also involved in shooting loyalist snipers, the BPA in East Belfast in particular, because of they tried to do a similar thing in East Belfast to the convent near the Short Strand as they did in Lisburn. So the army was involved there. They took quite sharp action and killed and shot quite a few members of the mob or bystanders.
So just moving on to, you mentioned at the start of your talk, the Pogrom Debate, as it's known.
Yeah.
You kind of went over some of the things that were in the question that was submitted. But I'm quite interested in, like, historians like Kieran Glennon, who they have an interesting approach to this whole thing, about if that's the term that the people of the time used, then maybe we should call it.
Well, certainly, yeah.
Just interested in what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was relatively topical in 1920, because that was about 20 odd years after the first modern pogroms in Europe, which was the intimidation of Jews in Russia, and many of them migrated, of course, after that, including many to some to Ireland, but mostly many of them to England. Yeah, I mean, I looked at that, but when I looked at the violence that was going on, I looked at the origins of the term pogrom, and it was basically based on the notion of one group suffering firstly all the violence, and so in other words, a completely disproportionate suffering. The Catholic community did suffer disproportionately. There's no question about that. But there were, as I said in the talk, quite a few cases of IRA activity, which resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries of Protestants. So it's not as simple as that. And I think if one wants to get a balanced version of history and a proper kind of insight into what really happened, you have to look at the full picture and not just what happened. But you're right, it was described at the time in nationalist journals like the Irish News as a pogrom, and other writers since have said. But I suppose it's a matter of interpretation, really.
It's just quite interesting. how it was used as a point of history, and really how it was used doesn't match up with its actual definition. So how does an historian deal with that? You know, the sort of the mislabeling of it almost, but on the one hand, but then again, contemporary sources at the time used it. It's a tricky one. We might never settle the Pogrom debate.
No, I think you're right. People do, but I think most many historians anyway, is some kind of agreement that that, for instance, the IRA's campaign of targeting police did backfire on them, and in a sense that by targeting police, Protestant politicians, and so on, it did actually have an impact on loyalists, taking it out on many innocent Catholics. So I think a lot of historians actually do accept that was the case.
So in this 1920 through to 22 period, I think your work really brings out how messy and grubby and sectarian nature of the conflict. And I noticed that at the end of your new book, which is very good, you put real emphasis on the role of the Special Powers Act.
Yes.
In some places, maybe national circles would be maligned. But actually, I think the point, and I hope I've read you right, is that it was actually quite useful in halting violence as a series of measures. It was actually quite effective.
Yes, it was. Although I have to say, some of the people that were picked up in 1922, like many people who were picked up in 1971, were not the godfathers of violence. Some of them were probably the monkeys. You know, they were just ordinary volunteers, and many of them, in fact, weren't directly involved in the IRA's activities. But you're right. I mean, they took this action, and it was partly the effects of internment and partly the effects of special powers legislation. But also, of course, you have to factor in the situation in the rest of Ireland, where the Civil War actually picked up in just as the war in the north was beginning to peter out, and many IRA volunteers had a practical choice to make whether to go off and join the Collins forces, the kind of pro-treaty forces, or to join the De Valera section, the anti-treaty forces. So they had that. I think you have to see both together, really, to get a full picture of what was happening.
I think you used an interesting phrase, something like halting Armageddon or something like that. It was really captures the spirit of the time.
Yeah, it was quite. I mean, it wasn't. As I think I mentioned in the talk about comparing it with the Long War and in the modern conflict, but it wasn't. It was quite a short. It was to be precise, about 2.25 year, 2.5 year. If you include the Derry troubles, 2.5 years, the whole thing. And the last conflict death was in October 22, for instance. Yeah.
I have a question now, and it's about one of the sort of darkest episodes, the McMahon murders. This is Colin Crean, and Colin, I've had the paraphrase here. I hope you don't mind. He says, I have a slim family connection to 3 of the victims of the alleged Nixon Harrison RIC murder gang, who allegedly killed perhaps 15 people, he says, in the period of 1920 to 22. He says, my question is about the word alleged. I have no interest in whataboutery, but when does something go from being suspicion, propaganda, allegation to being regarded as historical fact? What can you tell me about the alleged RIC murder gang? Can I drop the word alleged?
Well, Nixon, of course, was a very interesting character, and he became an independent unionist MP after all this settled. And a newspaper in England and a book came out many years ago and accused him directly of this. And he won legal fees over it, took him to court, nearly bankrupted the firm. So the evidence, as I said in both books, does suggest that senior rogue cop involvement in those incidents was probably happened, but we do not have definitive evidence. Some of the records that are interesting, they were one wasn't allowed to look at them until quite recently, but the senior unionist establishment wanted to get rid of Nixon in particular, and also Harrison. But he had a large popular base of support, particularly in the Shankill Road in Belfast, and it was a very difficult job to get rid of him. I think if one takes as an historian a kind of a neutral position and tries to do a little bit of detective work, I think it is likely, the strongest I would go to, would be that it was likely that he and his associates could be accused of actually taking part in it, because of the nature of the murders and what the background was. It was a time of curfew. No cars, and there weren't that many cars anyway in 1920, but no big vehicles were to be seen during the hours of curfew. When, for instance, many of these murders, including the McMahons, actually happened. And so it was, in that sense, the fact that the assassins were able to do this, stroll away afterwards, and all of that suggests that that it was not ordinary citizens doing that. Because ordinary citizens, if they had been out in curfew hours, ran the risk, particularly if they were armed, of being shot. Many people were shot actually during the curfew hours. So I'll go. That's probably as far as one can really go on that. It's I haven't seen anybody in print going any further.
You're limited by the evidence, really.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think you have to read between the lines, and not. It's very difficult, I know, but not to get through a motive. Yeah. To read between the lines and draw your conclusions, and let your writing speak for itself, really.
Yeah, well, not to draw parallels between the two or anything, but like the involvement of D.I. Swansea in the murder of McCurtain, and there's no smoking gun. All you have is circumstantial evidence, quite strong circumstantial evidence in places, but you never know. I'd imagine you'll never know definitively.
Yes, yeah.
Cork IRA were fairly convinced he was involved, but again, you'll never know.
That's right, yeah.
Just on our last question, I've asked Professor Brian Walker the same question. I'm going to ask all our speakers here. So we're in the centenary year of Northern Ireland, the 100th anniversary. So are you optimistic about plans to mark or celebrate the centenary? Is there anything you're...
as an historian, I think it would be totally wrong for us not to mark. I think the word I would personally wouldn't use the word celebrate, because if you're talking about celebrating, that puts 40% of the people against the whole idea of remembering the occasion. I think it's crucial, just as it was crucial to remember the 1916 revolution and rising and all of that. I think it's crucial to investigate what happened in the North during that pivotal period of two or 3 years. And I think hopefully something good might come out of it, that we might become more aware of one another's traditions and feelings and sense of history. I think there's not enough of that. You get some of that in the cloisters of Queens and places like that, but perhaps not enough of it in the rest of society. So I think it should be remembered. I'm not sure about the term celebration, but anyway, yeah.
Well, just like to say thanks very much for your time here. Really enjoyed your talk. Really interesting. And thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. I'll be in touch. Yeah. Thank you.